Hi everyone, and welcome back to the intermediate chess course. Last lesson we looked at how to restrain the enemy king and to perhaps check the enemy king when we're trying to defend a position where we're down on material, for example. When we're losing, we want to perhaps consider whether a draw might be a possibility and whether we can head towards that draw. Sometimes have to be quite practical in the way that we approach the game. So accepting that you're down on material is a good thing, because you can understand what your next step is going to be, whether it's going to be aiming towards a draw or trying to generate some kind of counterplay, some kind of counter strategy. But today I thought we'd talk about capturing in chess. Now, when you're winning on material, often it's good to swap off pieces. Imagine like a rugby game or something like that, where you imagine you had something like 4 against 3, 4 players against 3 on one side of the pitch. Now that's pretty good. You got an overload, I think it's called. But compare that to 3 against 2. Well, again, then it's a little bit easier because there's less that can go wrong. There's only 2 players that can stop you. And again, 2 against 1 is always going to be pretty good for the attacking team, because there's only 1 player that can possibly stop you getting a try. And then obviously the best thing entirely is 1 against 0, because then you've got a free run to the end to get a try. So think about that in chess too. We want to try to swap off pieces. And the opposite is true if you're defending. If you're points down in the game, you want to try to avoid swapping off your best pieces if you can. There are lots of different scenarios of this, and I wanted to perhaps show you now how to approach this. Now, notice I have an example. I think before we do the capturing puzzles, we'll do a little starter puzzle. The move that White does in this position is this, in order to threaten checkmate. So that looks pretty good, right? Looks like we're in a bit of trouble for Black. But actually, Black here has a particularly strong move. I'm wondering if you can spot what it is. You can set the board up if you like. And how do we turn the game around? Pause the video. Well, given that White is threatening checkmate here, notice the queen and helper checkmate. That's always going to be a problem for us. We can't really stop this from happening, except if we counterattack. Now, you may have noticed that the king here is quite vulnerable. So if we can somehow access the king, then we have a good chance of getting a checkmate ourselves. Now, I'd be very impressed if you got this move, queen to e3 check. So notice that this is a kind of a fork. So obviously the king can't move away, because then it will be checkmate with this. This is a queen sacrifice. The rook is then distracted, takes the queen. If we take this back, then we'll just get checkmated. So we can't do that. But can you now spot the checkmate? Well, the answer is this. Rook down to f1, checkmate. Notice that the bishop is protecting the rook, and that stops the king from taking it. It can't go here because of the rook, here because of the bishop, and here because of the rook. And there's nothing else that White can do. So that is a very nice checkmate using the bishop and the rook. Okay, so just again, a distraction technique to distract the rook, and then checkmate. So back again to the concept of swapping pieces. So Black has just done this move, queen to d5. Now again, set this board up if you want. You may not need to in this scenario. You can just look at it on the diagram. But in this scenario, would you swap off the queens as White? Well, count the material. We've got queen against queen, but Black has got 2 extra pawns. So they will easily manage to get a queen. So if we did swap off, then Black would recapture, and all that they would need to do is alternately just march these pawns down the board, like this. There's nothing that white can do to stop both of them if they march down at the same time. So that is obviously not going to help us. So what could we play instead as white? Instead of taking this queen, what should we do? Well, a much better move would be to counterattack. A move such as this. Queen to h6 check. Notice we're doing a fork against king and against pawn. And optionally, we could, if this king moved out the way, let's say like here, we have a choice of two pawns we can capture. We have perhaps this one, or this one. So we have a chance here perhaps to draw the game. Now notice that it's not clear just yet whether we can win, but which one would you take? Which pawn would you take here? Well, I think perhaps the safer pawn to take could be this one. Now, if we take this pawn here, there's always a chance that the black could try to swap off our queen. Now, luckily for us, we should be just in time to catch this pawn. So, but if we take the queen now, that would be okay, because we can then run across and we will catch the pawn easily. Catch this very easily like that. And so therefore, we have to time our swap to perfection. We don't want to swap too early because we will lose. But if we see an opportunity to draw the game, then we can do that. Okay, so a move such as queen over here, instead of swapping the queen like this, would be a much better move. Okay, another example. Here we are in a sort of, well, I suppose, towards the end of the opening. This is quite a typical scenario. You might find this if you play something called the Queen's Gambit. Now, if you're not sure what that is, I would say look that up on the Lichess video function. Type in Queen's Gambit or Queen's Gambit declined. This is a sort of opening that a lot of top players use, and it involves a very solid structure using these two center pawns. The bishop is, notice, it's outside of this kind of pawn chain. It's not stuck in this area, it's outside. And the bishop here can access squares through the pawns. Okay, so something like this. So notice again the position of the knights, very nicely placed, and the position of the rooks too. You could say the same about black. Black is fairly well placed at the moment. And a move that black could do is this one. Knight to e4. You think, interesting. I'm going to try and hop into the center of the board where I've got an opportunity to attack white's pieces. Now, not only is black perhaps creating an attack maybe on the knight or pawn or whatever, they're also creating a threat against another piece. Now, can you see what that threat is? Pause the video if you need to. Well, the other threat is bishop takes bishop. It's a discovered attack. It's a discovered attack, so one of those four main tactical ideas. So we've got the skewer, the fork, the pin, and the discovered attack, which is probably the most dangerous of all four. So I would imagine that before we deal with the threat to the knight, or against, dealing with the knight in general, we should probably resolve the problem here. That is a threat. Black will probably just do this. The question is, should we take this knight? And if so, with what? Again, pause the video and we'll see if you can come up with some kind of analysis for me. Well, this is interesting. If we take this knight with our knight, there's actually not a particularly strong move, I wouldn't say. Because what would happen is that black would recapture with the pawn, okay? And notice that pawn is very well protected by three pieces, and they're doing a fork against us. And well, even if we try to do an in-between move, such as running away like this, to attack the rook, well, then in that case, black could just block us, so that wouldn't quite work either. So notice the difference here. There's a chance for black to do a fork. Therefore, we do not want to take that knight with our knight. That would end badly. There's another option, perhaps, which is to take with the bishop, which I don't think is a bad move particularly. But again, we are losing a bishop there for a knight. I would recommend really trying to keep the bishops on the board if you can. If you swap a bishop off for a knight, it's got to be for a very good reason. And I don't believe that that is a good enough reason to remove it. It's obviously a very strong knight in the center of the board. But after this move, well, I think perhaps black has succeeded in getting a bit more space in the center, more control of the center here too, and basically a bit more space. So I think that is possible. It's a better move than taking with the knight, but nonetheless, it may well just be better to find an alternative. I would recommend maybe a move such as this one, let's say. It seems to be good at first anyway. We're putting pressure on the knight and also perhaps putting pressure down towards this pawn here with the help of our rook. So often in these situations, unless there's a good reason to take, I would recommend not doing so. Imagine that you're playing as your opponent. Your opponent, most likely, if they put a piece somewhere where it can be taken, then they may want you to take it. That's their thinking process. They think, well, if these pieces are swapped off, then that will benefit me. So in chess, you have to be very stubborn. You have to say to yourself, right, well, if that's what my opponent wants, then obviously that's not what I want, because that's not going to benefit me. You want to fight against your opponent and be very stubborn. So that is an important, I think, an important tip. Let's go on to a third, and perhaps I think we've got time for a couple more examples. This one here is something you may see or may have seen in your games. There's always a chance for a bishop to, if it's positioned well in the center of the board, it can often attack pawns on the side of the board. You may see the same sort of thing with the bishop placed here, attacking a pawn here. The question is, should we take this pawn? Is it a safe move, do you think? Again, pause the video and tell me what you think. Well, at first, it appears to be safe. And you might think, well, okay, well, the king can't approach it, so therefore I can always run away. But the thing is, black can do a move such as this one. Black can trap the bishop in that cave, I suppose. It means that the bishop can't escape. We'll see if it does, then black will take. I should mention that this is a very simplified example. I haven't put any more pieces on the board just to make it easier to see. Obviously, in some endgames, it may be advantageous to sacrifice a bishop for 2 pawns or whatever, because you may be able to achieve a draw. What I mean is here that the bishop is trapped. So all that black has to do is come across and take the bishop, and then it's going to be well, it's unclear in this position who would win, but I think black has got obviously the much better chance because he's got the pawn. White has nothing. But in a middle game situation, then you don't really want to get your bishop stuck. You'll end up a piece down. So just beware of these little traps. If you're going to take a pawn like this at the side, make sure that your bishop is not going to be trapped by this pawn. Okay? I think one final example. I think this is the last example. Let me just check. Yes, it is. Okay. This is the last example. So in this position, you'll notice that we are winning on material. So the rook against rook is going to be equal, but we have a knight and 2 pawns extra. That's 5 points. And that should be enough to win the game, because all we need to do is we need to get one or both of these pawns to the end with the help of our king and with the help of our knight. when we get one of these pawns to the end, we can get a queen, and we can hopefully win the game very easily. But there's one thing standing in our way. Remember that the example that I was telling you earlier about the rugby, getting a try in rugby. You want to remove the defender so that there's no chance that the opposing team can stop your plan, can thwart your plan. So with the help of some tactics, we can find a way to swap off that rook for our rook. Now, how would we do it? Pause the video, and again, set the board up if you need to. This is perfectly fine. And let me know. This is a 2-move sequence, okay? What we need to do is set up a fork, okay? So first of all, we're going to use a pin idea. This is a pin. Notice that if black simply tries to avoid taking the rook, then we can just take their rook, and that would achieve what we want. So black has to therefore take this rook. And now, can you see a second trick? We've had a pin. Can we see a fork? Well, I think this one is fairly straightforward, isn't it? It's this one, knight to d6. And then, after the king moves here, we can take the rook. So even though we've lost our knight, we still have these 2 pawns. So we've invested a bit of material. We're sort of giving our opponent a bit of material as a treat. But in return, these pawns will be able to get to the end. Let's have a quick demonstration of how that might occur. So first of all, it's a good idea to try to cut off the king. Try and stop the king from coming back. The king is obviously trying to get back. But what we need to do is create a buffer. So what would you do in this position in order to stop the king from coming across there? The best move is basically to do this. King to g7. Because now the king cannot approach ours, and that means that this pawn basically has a free run to the end. So we have king up, and then there's no way at all that the king can approach this one, and the pawn will reach the end easily. And we maybe even be able to get a second queen later. Let me just emphasize the process one more time. Going back to this situation, we want to use the king as a buffer. That is very important in order to stop black's king from approaching, like creating a wall, okay, so that our pawn can get forward. So the king is the most important piece in the endgame, and try to make sure that the king is doing a lot of work in the endgame. That is very important, especially if you're trying to win the game. That is a very important tip. Okay, so I'll unshare my screen. Again, hopefully that was beneficial for you, and recap if you need to about exchanging pieces and whether it is safe to do so. Always ask yourself before you exchange a piece, question whether you can take it with another piece. Is it better to take with a big piece such as the queen or rook, or better to take with a pawn? Sometimes you might end up doubling your pawns, which is maybe not what you want. So always take a little bit of time just to consider whether swapping is good, and if so, what to take the piece with. We can call this exchanging pieces. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that, and see you next time.